just pass you over to Iain now.
Thanks very much, Hannah, and thanks everyone for having me here today. So, Youth Justice Conference 2022. I think if you told me I'd be here 10 years ago, I'd have laughed in your face. If you told me I'd be sitting in my tartan jammies and a pair of Crocs while I did it, I'd probably laugh doubly hard. So who am I and why am I in front of you today? Like Hannah said, I'm Iain Corbett. I am a youth worker and a community development practitioner. I've got a history in theatre and performing arts. I'm married to the wonderful Rebecca. I've got 3 dogs. I've got over 250 pairs of trainers. I've got 10 toes but only 8 toenails, and if you look really closely, I can be found on Netflix twice. I've also got multiple criminal convictions and a history of navigating the justice system as a young person. So obviously it's the latter that has brought me here today. I'm now working to utilise my own experiences and to amplify the experiences of those that I work with to help benefit others. I had the privilege of joining CYTJ's executive governance group as a result of their participation strategy to include lived experience at all levels of the organisation, and I'm also currently working towards a postgraduate qualification in children and young people in conflict with the law. The roles I've worked in over the last few years has seen me work and engage and support young people in a variety of settings, from third sector and youth work settings to schools, universities and nurseries, and even housing associations and healthcare settings. And the first thing I want to highlight is the abundance of good practice that I see daily around participation, particularly around youth voice, and when looking at Article 31 of the UNCRC, the right to play and the access to culture and arts. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in policy. I'm not an expert in practice. And I'm going to ask you more questions than I can answer, but I'm just really keen to explore how do we do better. So in the hope that young people going forward have better experiences than those gone by. I apologise for any duplication, but I do want to explore this theme with a particular focus on upholding children's rights. So the UNCRC, as we know, outlines children's rights and therefore provides a framework and a checklist to ensure that children's rights for children and young people are upheld. So today is just some of my reflections in regards to participation and co-production with young people who have experience in navigating the justice system. In the interest of time, I'll use the summarised articles that I'm going to explore in my reflections. First one I want to look at is Article 42. So everyone must know children's rights. So there's a vast amount of work going on with practitioners and professionals to increase the awareness of children's rights and make sure it's implemented. But how are we widening our reach with parents and carers and others that children engage with outside access services? The UNCRC supplements and enhances existing human rights for children, which is great in theory, but we need to acknowledge that adults are still the gatekeepers to that information. So how do we provide opportunities for children and young people to explore their rights in their own way, to immerse themselves in the convention and to arrive at their own questions? What pathways are we creating if a child thinks that their rights are violated, and how are we communicating that to children and young people? Who's accountable and to what level is their accountability? Articles 12, 13 and 14 of the UNCRC explore respect for children's views, share thoughts freely and the right to freedom of thought or religion. Again, I want to reiterate millions of great practice around youth voice and participation in service design and delivery, but how do we do better? How do we encourage freedom of thought? We live in a time, particularly in Scotland, where there's a lot of polarising views: Remain, Brexit, independence, union, vax, anti-vax, Rangers, Celtic. And we know that people's views are shaped by those around them, whether it's in the family or the wider society. So how do we provide space to encourage critical thinking and analytical skills? How do we provide opportunities to explore dialogue and deliberation without adult influence, to not just support voice, but to encourage progressive thinking and to build on their own sense of identity? Article 39 says children and young people have the right to recover from the difficult things that happen to them. I think we need to be careful of language, despite intention. I remember distinctly being told that if I got a conviction, I would never get a job. I would never go to university if I had a conviction, that I would just be a deadbeat and I wouldn't go anywhere. I've been to university, I'm back at university, I work for university. These things don't support recovery. If I hadn't believed it was the end of the road for me when I got conviction number 1, maybe I wouldn't have got conviction number 2 or 3 or 4. I'm not trying to remove any accountability from myself in that. But as adults and professionals, We know about adverse childhood experiences, we know about trauma, we know about toxic stress, but we need to communicate that and educate young people too, no matter how difficult the conversation. A number of prominent lived experience professionals across the sector in Scotland have openly spoken about how their recovery began when they understood trauma and ACEs in their mid-20s. The VRU's James Docherty spoke about that recently at the Compassionate Prison Conference. The same's true for me. I was 24 years old before I had any education in trauma, before I understood why I did the things that I did. Can you imagine how many years of pain and suffering we could avoid if we equip young people with the tools to recover at the earliest possible point? If we give them coping mechanisms and the tools to understand and to regulate their emotions? So how do we do better? We know the cards are stacked against these young people, but we're not even trying to teach them to play the hand that they're dealt. We need to work with young people to be able to articulate and to contextualise and to reframe their experiences and to extract the learning. We need to teach them that they're better than the worst thing that they've ever done, and we need to give them hope. We need to show them techniques to model that their experiences or convictions don't define them. We need to provide examples of how to present their humanity before their experiences or convictions. We need to give them techniques like explaining that they have an interest in background in the arts, that they've got 3 dogs, are married to the wonderful Rebecca, have a ludicrous amount of shoes and can be found on Netflix twice if you look carefully. We need to help them see that the skills and the resilience developed in these environments are transferable and that they can be assets in the workplace and in further education. It's probably fair as well to acknowledge the limitations of my own experience. Like I said, I'm not an expert in policy, I'm not an expert in practice, and my experiences are that, mine. So unfortunately, I'm no longer a young person. My convictions are circa 15 years old and dropping off my PVG daily. And the justice system and legislation has changed considerably since I navigated it. So as a practitioner, there's questions that I need to ask myself as well. How do we capture the views and experiences of children and young people currently navigating the justice system and empower them to recover, firstly, but also to influence system improvement? How do we learn from the examples of best practice, such as Youth Justice Voices with their Inside Out, STAR, National Leadership Network, or the recent Thinking About Justice consultation? And how do we take the learning from that and ensure that that becomes the rule rather than the exception? How do we get better at modelling? How do we empower lived experience and peer role models that shift the narrative for young people who have a deep distrust of the services that are meant to help them? How do we do better? Lastly, I want to look at Article 40. So the first line of the summarised UNCRC states that a child guilty or accused of breaking the law must be treated with dignity and respect. Right now, lived experience is a buzzword in the political, service and funding landscapes, and probably rightly so. But how do we maintain dignity and respect when utilising lived experience? As I mentioned, we know ACEs and trauma are often at work when a young person gets a conviction. So by asking them to share their experience or their learning, we need to be conscious that we're often asking them to relive that trauma. Utilising lived experience is usually done with the purest of intentions, but how are the people compensated? How are we addressing the power imbalance between those with an academic or theoretical expertise and those with lived experience? How do we acknowledge that both of those experience sets are essential and try and level the playing field? Think of it this way. I want you to think back to a time before you could drive. If you can't drive, it'll be easier. You've never sat in a car, you've never taken a driving lesson, you've never looked at the highway code. Someone hands you a piece of paper with instructions written at the top of it. You look at the instructions, it shows you what the pedals are and explains what each one does. It tells you when you should check your mirrors, it tells you what the speed signs mean, when you should apply the handbrake and what the stopping distance is in the rain. If I was to chuck you the keys for the car at that point, could you drive? Well, it's only when the experience and the learning come together that we can really move forward or backwards, if that's where we need to go. So thinking again about the car, when it breaks down, we take it to a mechanic who diagnoses the problem, they fix it and we pay them. If our IT systems at work stop talking to one another in our organisation, we get a consultant, they diagnose the problem, we fix it and we pay them. And yet people, and in particular young people with lived experience, are constantly used as consultants. We harvest information, we harvest pain, we harvest trauma, and we use it to inform and improve our services. But in many cases, and there are exceptions, I'm probably preaching to the converted here today, but in many cases, they get nothing back. They get no money, they get no learning, they get no opportunity. So if we think back to Article 40, I'll leave you with these questions. Is it dignified? Is it respectful? Is it justice? And how do we do better? Thank you.
Iain, thank you so much. It's really great to have you here, and I'm glad we invited you for your experience and expertise and not your lack of toenails, although now I'm always going to think that when I see you. There's a few questions. I think we've got a couple of minutes, and obviously there's some chat and some love for you there. But Iain, one of the questions is there a conflict between lived experience and being a practitioner or a professional in this field? And do you feel there's any stigma attached to having lived experience? And if so, how can we tackle that?
Yes, I think there is a stigma and I think there is a conflict. But I think what I've noticed, particularly working in university settings and with various centres, is that everyone's got the best intentions, and it's almost like the flip side's alien. So I've now been in a position for a few years where I'm sort of traversing two worlds, where I'm seen as this sort of person that can go in and work with young people and work in communities of deprivation and be able to build relationships, but also can sit with Scottish Government and academics and sort of navigate those two worlds as well. And they're both scared of one another, but they both want the same thing. And I think that's heartbreaking in the first instance, but it means that there's the possibility of improvement. I think we need to get better at communicating. I think when, like working for Glasgow University, I was working in areas of multiple deprivation, but literally it was based in an ivory tower. Now, how things are framed and the perceptions of these relationships are very different. So I think we just need to provide spaces where people can meet and communicate and realise that academics or people with theoretical expertise aren't wanting to use these people as guinea pigs. There's genuine desire to help, but without having a lived experience and fully understanding what it's like to be immersed in those situations, then that's difficult. So I think we need to provide more opportunities, like you guys at CYCJ are doing it, and various other people. It's becoming a lot more popular, but there are conflicts and there is still a lot of work to be done. But I think we're getting better at it, and it's becoming less tokenistic. So I'm hopeful.
Okay. Listen, Iain, thanks so much. There is some chat and maybe some other questions, so I'll let you take your time if you've got some time after this to have a look through it. But listen, thanks again for sharing that with us. I think we really appreciate it, and some it's very refreshing perspective. So thank you so